"You're not a real soldier, you're just playing dress-up for attention." That was the moment everything snapped. Karen, the president of our neighborhood HOA, spat those words with a sneer as she ripped my flag off my porch and dropped it on the concrete like trash. The flag I had carried with me through Afghanistan, Iraq, and more desert storms than I could count. The same flag that draped my friend James' casket when we flew his body home. My hand clenched so hard around the grill tongs I was holding, I nearly bent them in half. She had no idea what she'd just unleashed. Because in less than 20 minutes, my entire Marine squad, 8 men built like tanks and loyal like wolves, were going to show up for our annual reunion barbecue. And Karen was about to find out the difference between a wannabe and a war-tested brotherhood. The morning had started like any other. I was jogging around the block, getting my morning reps in, when I passed Karen trimming her rose bushes. She glanced up, gave me that practiced smile-turned-smirk, and let her eyes settle on my tags bouncing against my chest. "Still wearing those? It's a bit dramatic, don't you think?" she called out without breaking eye contact. I ignored her, like I always did, and kept running. I'd gotten used to her passive-aggressive comments about my haircut, my boots, the way I stood too straight, but today she was especially venomous. Maybe it was because her HOA vote on community pool renovations failed last week, or maybe she just needed a new target. I got back to my porch, unhooked the small American flag from the railing, and carefully straightened it. It wasn't for show. It was a daily habit, like saluting the sun or checking your 6 before moving through a room. It kept me grounded. But just as I was hooking it back up, Karen marched across the street like she owned the pavement. She was wearing her usual pastel pink tracksuit, oversized sunglasses despite the clouds, and had that damn clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. "You know the HOA guidelines prohibit excessive or political displays on private property," she said, already reaching toward the flag. "We've had complaints." I stepped between her and the flagpole. "That flag isn't political. It's mine. It's military issued. That's not just nylon, that's memory." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, spare me. You're not a real soldier. If you were, you wouldn't still be parading around like you are. People who actually served don't act like this." Then, without asking, she reached around me and yanked the flag off the hook. That was when it happened. She tossed it on the porch floor and said the one thing that made my pulse skip. "You're just a wannabe soldier. You wear the costume, but everyone can see through it." I didn't yell. I didn't flinch. I just picked up the flag slowly, folded it properly, and stepped back inside my house. She kept ranting, something about filing a formal report and community disruption, but her voice faded into the background. I walked into my living room, sat down, and stared at the framed photo of me and my squad, Operation Iron Shield, 2011. My phone buzzed. It was a group message, touchdown, en route. "You better have ribs." I smiled. Within the hour, the street would be filled with my brothers. Real Marines. A squad of men I would follow into hell without hesitation. Guys who'd pulled me from rubble in Fallujah, who'd radioed for medevac when I took shrapnel to the leg, who carried me when I couldn't walk. We didn't need medals or flags or uniforms to prove who we were. We had scars and stories and bonds that didn't break. And now, Karen was about to have a front row seat. I stepped outside again, this time holding a folding table under one arm and a tray of marinated ribs in the other. Karen was still there, arms crossed, acting like a border patrol agent guarding some sacred HOA line. "You're going to throw a party after that little stunt?" she asked, voice dripping with sarcasm. I didn't answer. I just set the table down, opened the cooler full of drinks, and started arranging chairs. 10 minutes later, the first black SUV pulled up. Then another. And another. 8 total. When the doors opened, it looked like a military convoy disembarking. 6-foot-plus guys in cargo pants, desert boots, some with tactical backpacks, one with a prosthetic leg and AK-9 by his side. Karen's face twisted like she'd bitten into a lemon. She took a step back, her mouth half open. One of the guys, Hector, nodded at her and said politely, "Ma'am," before walking past like she wasn't worth more than a glance. The guys greeted me with bear hugs, rough slaps on the back, and the kind of laughter you only hear in safe zones after surviving fire zones. They didn't even need instructions. They started setting up tents, stringing flags representing different Marine battalions, and turning my backyard into a full-on ops camp, with a smoker. Karen kept watching from across the street, phone clutched in her hand like it was a panic button. Then she made her next mistake. She called the cops. It took them 7 minutes to arrive. 2 patrol cars, lights on, rolling in with mild confusion. Karen practically ran to them. "There's some kind of paramilitary group forming on the street," she said dramatically. "They've got tents, dogs, weapons. I think they're trying to intimidate me." One of the officers calmly approached me. I greeted him by name, Officer Rains. We'd met before during a local PTSD outreach fundraiser. His eyes lit up when he saw Hector. "No way," he said, breaking into a smile. "You guys were on the unit that saved that bus of school kids overseas, right?" Hector nodded. "That was us." They shook hands. Karen's mouth fell open again, this time speechless. The other officer gave a short laugh and said, "Ms. Dawson, this is not a militia. This is a group of veterans. They have every right to assemble." She tried to argue, but both officers walked off to grab a plate of ribs before heading back to the cruiser. By sunset, the whole neighborhood was outside. Kids played tag between camo tents. Parents chatted with Marines. Karen, defeated for the moment, retreated behind her curtains. But I knew she wasn't done. And the rest of the week? That's when the real fireworks began. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing like a beehive kicked over by a boot. Word had spread fast about the Marine invasion on my property. Some neighbors were excited, bringing over pie tins and trays of food like we were hosting a 4th of July block party. Others were cautiously curious, especially after Karen's late-night emails to the community thread, dramatically titled "Military Occupation, Our Neighborhood at Risk." She wrote that I was running a covert operation, that our gathering was a show of force, and that the HOA board needed to take immediate action before the neighborhood turned into a barracks of chaos. My squad got a good laugh out of it over morning coffee and eggs. By mid-morning, we had transformed my yard into a mini training ground. Not for combat, nothing illegal or crazy, but for showing local kids some fun and discipline. We set up obstacle courses using ropes, cones, and tires. Kids lined up with eyes wide, copying our hand signals, crawling under ropes, and tumbling into grass with giggles. Parents took pictures. A few teared up hearing the stories from my squad. Sergeant Clint showed them how to shine their shoes military style, and Corporal Sanders let a kid sit on his shoulders while waving a tiny flag. Karen watched from across the street, red-faced, arms stiff at her sides like she was resisting the urge to storm over again. You could tell she hadn't expected this level of support from the community. What was supposed to be her big gotcha moment had turned into a full-on celebration of veterans, and she was losing control by the second. But she wasn't done yet. She marched straight to the community center, filed an emergency complaint with the HOA board, and scheduled a meeting that night, claiming it was urgent. On the sign-in sheet she wrote, "Paramilitary gathering threatens HOA stability." She also didn't know that one of my guys, Gavin, used to work counterintel and now ran security audits for government agencies. When she called the police again that afternoon, saying we had unauthorized tactical drills going on in the yard, Gavin had already anticipated it. He showed the arriving officers a printed waiver from the city allowing temporary assembly for veterans, complete with a permit for community engagement outreach signed weeks in advance. It wasn't just a barbecue, it was a registered veteran appreciation event, something I'd been planning for months but hadn't told Karen because, frankly, I didn't think she deserved the courtesy. Officer Rains, once again, arrived shaking his head. He stepped out of the patrol car with a soda in hand and said, I should start charging Karen rent for the time I'm spending here. My squad chuckled. Karen stood nearby, fuming like a kettle about to whistle, holding a clipboard with what she probably thought were legal codes she had printed off the internet. When she tried to argue, Rains cut her off mid-sentence. "Ma'am, not only is this event legal, but half the precinct is scheduled to swing by this evening for ribs." Karen's eyes went wide. "You're supporting this nonsense?" Rains just grinned. "Ma'am, these men fought for our freedom. You should be thanking them, not calling 911 because a flag makes you uncomfortable." After that, Karen changed tactics. She couldn't fight city permits. She couldn't win over the police. So she tried to dig deeper and get dirty. That night, we caught wind of it from an unexpected source. Mr. Jacobs, the soft-spoken neighbor who rarely got involved in anything. He stopped by as we were winding down for the evening and said, "I thought you boys should know. Karen's trying to file a stolen valor complaint on you." I froze. My stomach turned. A fake stolen valor claim isn't just annoying, it's serious. It's a stain on your name, your service, your life. Karen had filed a report with the State Veterans Board, saying I was impersonating military service for personal gain and intimidation. She claimed I was wearing unearned patches, that I had no service record, and was misleading the community under the guise of patriotism. I was stunned. Furious didn't even come close to what I felt. But I wasn't about to lose my temper. That's not what Marines do. We handle it. So I called my buddy Marcus. Not only had he served with me, but he'd gone to law school afterward and was now a high-profile veterans' rights attorney. I gave him the summary and he just laughed. "You picked the right week for her to screw up," he said. "I just finished a case like this last month. And I've got your service record saved in my cloud. We're going to end this before she even knows what hit her." I sent him everything I had: deployment orders, discharge papers, citations, photographs, even a video clip from a D.C. parade where I stood beside a U.S. Senator during a Medal of Honor ceremony. Meanwhile, we prepared for Karen's emergency HOA meeting like we were heading into a mission briefing. We dressed sharp, civilian clothes, but pressed and clean. My guys sat in a formation in the community center chairs, not saying a word, letting the silence do all the talking. The other board members showed up slowly, looking unsure. Karen walked in last, proud and puffed up, holding a manila folder like it was a loaded gun. She started speaking fast, rushing through made-up points about HOA violations, weaponized gatherings, impersonations, and national security optics. It was obvious she'd stayed up all night crafting her little manifesto. But halfway through, Gavin raised his hand. Karen ignored him. He stood anyway. "Ma'am, just so you're aware, before you accuse someone of federal-level fraud, maybe make sure you're not the one who's wrong. Because if you are," he paused, "you're looking at one hell of a defamation case." Karen scoffed, but the room started murmuring. Then I stood and calmly walked up to the board table. I placed a thick folder in front of them. "My real record," I said, then nodded to the president of the board. "You'll find everything you need in there. Proof of service, years enlisted, multiple tours, letters from my COs, and even a commendation from a sitting U.S. Senator." Silence blanketed the room as the board flipped through the pages. Karen's smile cracked first. Then her hands started trembling. She reached for the folder, but the board president pulled it closer and said, "Karen, this is real. Everything in here checks out." Her voice rose, desperate now. But he threatened me. He and his little army." That's when Clint stood up and said coolly, "Ma'am, if we wanted to intimidate you, you'd know. But we don't intimidate. We serve." The board fell into stunned silence. One member quietly muttered, "I think we need to discuss this further, privately." Karen was escorted out of the room while the rest of us remained seated. She didn't know it yet, but she had just activated something far bigger than an HOA spat. She had declared war on a Marine, and his brothers weren't going to let it slide. The fallout from the HOA meeting spread faster than wildfire on dry brush. By the next morning, screenshots of Karen's absurd claims were circulating in private neighborhood chats. One of the board members, a tired-looking retired school principal named Donna, quietly reached out to me and apologized for even letting Karen bring that mess into the meeting. She said, "If I'd known the kind of service you gave this country, I would have shut her down before she ever opened her mouth." I told her it wasn't about the apology. It was about respect, and Karen had bulldozed through every line of it. But it wasn't over. Karen was still grasping for anything that might work, and what she tried next showed just how deep into delusion she had fallen. Karen filed another complaint. This time, she claimed that the Marines gathering at my house had damaged HOA common property. She pointed to a tiny patch of grass near the sidewalk that had tire marks, which actually came from the neighborhood trash truck the day before. Still, she sent photos to the board and demanded I pay restitution and issue a written apology for disrespecting neighborhood property. She included lines like intentional sabotage and disruption of suburban peace. I didn't even respond. Not directly. I had already handed everything over to Marcus, and he was preparing a legal response that would make her head spin. In the meantime, Gavin did some digging. Not shady stuff, just smart, thorough fact-finding. He found that Karen had a long track record of filing false complaints, but most people in the neighborhood were either too scared or too indifferent to push back. There were reports from years ago where she'd accused a teenager of vandalism for stepping on a lawn sprinkler, and even one where she tried to fine a war widow for flying her late husband's flag after hours. The board had quietly swept it all under the rug because Karen handled most of the paperwork no one else wanted to do. Turns out, she wasn't just drunk on power. She had practically written her own rulebook over the years. Gavin compiled it all into a dossier, meticulously organized, color-coded, and with citations. He called it Karen's Commandments. We passed it around the squad like a mission folder. Everyone took a turn reading it, flipping pages while shaking their heads. Hector laughed the hardest. This is like a psychological profile of a dictator with a Pinterest board. What really stunned us was just how long Karen had gone unchecked. But not anymore. We decided it was time for a public reckoning, legal, factual, and professional. And it started with the next HOA meeting, scheduled for the end of the week. The days leading up to it were calm on the surface, but you could feel tension simmering underneath. Karen had mostly gone quiet, which meant she was either planning something big or desperately trying to cover her tracks. Meanwhile, neighbors started coming over, not just to talk, but to show support. Some brought pies. Some brought stories. One older gentleman, a Vietnam vet named Henry who rarely left his house, came over with a cane and said, "I've lived here 20 years. She's made life hell for vets like me. You boys stand tall." That meant more to me than anything. We used the extra days to prep our presentation like it was a court case. Marcus helped us organize everything. Our documentation, witness statements, HOA rulebook excerpts, Karen's emails, and the city permits we'd followed to the letter. Then we printed copies for every board member and left nothing out. Gavin even pulled a few favors and got a notarized letter from a federal Veterans Council verifying my military history. It was airtight. When the night of the HOA meeting arrived, the community center was more packed than I'd ever seen it. People brought folding chairs. A few had printed their own shirts that said, "Respect the vets," and "Real heroes don't need clipboards." You could feel a shift in energy. Karen walked in with her usual swagger, wearing a blue blazer and holding a thick binder, trying to look important. But her smile faltered the moment she saw how full the room was, and that every eye was already on her. The board president, a quiet accountant named Leonard, opened the meeting with the usual roll call and announcements. Then he cleared his throat and said, "We've received some serious complaints in recent days, as well as overwhelming support for one of our community members. Tonight, we're going to get some clarity." That was our cue. I walked to the front with Marcus at my side. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the table. I just laid out the truth. I showed my records, my service documentation, the veteran event permits, and statements from neighbors. I showed the board everything Karen had ignored or deliberately twisted. Then I handed over Gavin's report, the dossier. Marcus explained how Karen's false claims not only put me through mental and reputational stress, but also opened the HOA to potential liability. When Karen tried to interrupt, Leonard stopped her. "You'll have your turn, Ms. Dawson. But please, let him finish." For once, she actually sat down. Then came the part no one expected. Gavin stood and presented an email trail he had recovered, old archived communications from HOA meetings years ago where Karen had unilaterally rewritten sections of the bylaws without board vote. In one email, she even joked to another board member, "Don't worry, they'll never read the fine print. I practically run this place." That was the moment the board began to shift from passive silence to active alarm. Leonard looked at her and said, "Is this true?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned red, clutching her binder like it might shield her from judgment. Then Clint, who had been quiet the whole time, stood up and said just one sentence. "We fought to protect people's freedoms, not to be policed by someone playing dictator in a cul-de-sac." That was when the crowd clapped. Slowly at first, then louder. The room was filled with it, claps, nods, and a few people even standing. Karen was frozen. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came. The board called for a recess. 15 minutes later, they returned with a statement. Leonard read it aloud. "Effective immediately, the board will form an oversight committee to review all prior violations issued by this HOA. Additionally, the board will suspend Ms. Dawson's authority to issue or enforce rules until the review is complete." Karen tried to protest, but her words were drowned out by the rising buzz of satisfaction in the room. The meeting ended with neighbors shaking our hands, some wiping tears, others asking for photos. Karen stormed out, binder clutched under her arm like a security blanket. But the damage was done. She wasn't just losing power. She was losing her grip on the community she had ruled through fear and paperwork. And while we hadn't planned it this way, it was clear that this wasn't just about one insult anymore. It was about setting something right for every veteran, every neighbor, and every person she'd ever steamrolled with that smug little clipboard. Karen's grip on the neighborhood had finally started to unravel, but instead of accepting reality, she doubled down with a level of desperation none of us were prepared for. By the following morning, she had sent out a mass email with the subject line, "Military Scare Tactic Cover-Up," accusing the board of being bullied into submission by a so-called rogue veteran group. She claimed the meeting had been hijacked, that the evidence we provided was fabricated, and that she feared for her safety in her own neighborhood. She attached blurry pictures of the barbecue tents and printed out screenshots of military gear she claimed was left in public view to terrorize the community. This time, though, no one was buying it. Even the neighbors who'd previously stayed quiet began to call her out. One woman replied all with, "Karen, please stop embarrassing us. This isn't about you anymore." Another simply responded with a photo of my veteran ID and the caption, "Receipts." Marcus, ever the tactician, advised we take the next step with precision. He filed a cease and desist letter on my behalf, officially warning Karen to stop spreading defamatory statements about my service and our gathering. It wasn't just a scare tactic. He attached legal documentation showing that we had more than enough grounds to pursue civil action for libel, harassment, and emotional distress. We sent a copy to the board and gave Karen a deadline to respond. Her silence was louder than any of her usual rants. For 2 whole days, she disappeared from sight. Her blinds stayed shut. Her garden went untended. Her clipboard, usually swinging like a badge of honor, was nowhere to be seen. But silence never lasts with people like her. On the 3rd morning, I stepped outside to find a hand-delivered letter taped to my front door. It was written in shaky cursive on HOA letterhead but unsigned. The letter claimed that my display of military memorabilia could be perceived as hostile, and that I was encouraged to keep such items indoors out of respect for those who may be sensitive to such symbols. I read it 3 times, trying to believe it was real. Then I scanned the signature line and found a small faint watermark in the corner. Karen's initials, watermarked using the template she made herself years ago when she unofficially designated herself as the neighborhood's executive enforcer. That was the final straw. I called Marcus, and he agreed it was time to act. We weren't just defending against slander anymore. We were launching a full legal response. Within hours, Marcus filed the initial paperwork for a defamation lawsuit. Karen would be served the documents within the week. Gavin, meanwhile, prepared a community bulletin of his own, one filled with nothing but facts. No opinions, no jabs. Just a clear timeline of what had actually occurred, all supported with photos, emails, and testimony. We posted it online and delivered copies door to door. Neighbors thanked us. One even cried, saying her husband, a Gulf War vet, had been afraid to fly his own flag because of Karen's reign of pettiness. Then came the twist none of us saw coming. News crews. Somehow, our little war with the HOA had caught the attention of a local journalist who specialized in suburban drama with viral potential. One of the neighbors had tipped them off anonymously, and now a camera van rolled down the street just as I was finishing my yard work. I tried to wave them off at first, not wanting the spotlight, but Marcus stepped in and handled it like a pro. He gave a brief statement about respecting veterans, protecting civil liberties, and standing up to bullies who used bureaucracy to silence good people. The piece aired that night, and by the next morning, our story had been picked up by a national veterans outlet online. Karen's house became a fortress. She stopped coming out. Her emails stopped too. But what she didn't realize was that in trying to bury me, she'd unearthed every skeleton in her own closet. The oversight committee the board created had started combing through her past HOA violations and found multiple discrepancies. Unvoted amendments, falsified approval logs, letters she had sent to homeowners without board signatures, dozens of violations that had cost residents money, stress, and in some cases, the threat of legal action. It was a pattern of abuse that now had a spotlight shining directly on it. The board called an emergency meeting, but this time they didn't even invite Karen. They voted unanimously to suspend her HOA privileges pending a full investigation, and Leonard made the announcement himself in a hand-delivered memo to every house. It read, in part, "The HOA exists to protect community interests, not personal vendettas. We are deeply sorry for the actions taken under the guise of enforcement, and we commit to rebuilding trust among our residents." It was the first official apology I'd ever seen from the board, and it felt like justice was finally gaining traction. But we weren't finished. The final piece of this puzzle had yet to be revealed. My squad and I had a plan, one that would flip this entire saga on its head and send a message no one would forget. With the help of our extended veteran community, we began organizing a new event, a Neighborhood Veterans Honor Day. We planned guest speakers, a flag ceremony, a moment of silence, and even arranged for a Marine Corps general, an old contact of mine, to make a surprise appearance. It would be open to the public and held on the very lawn Karen had once called her personal sanctuary of HOA order. When word spread, volunteers came pouring in. Kids offered to hand out programs. Local musicians volunteered to play the national anthem. A nearby fire department offered to bring a ladder truck to raise a massive flag. Everyone was in. Everyone, it seemed, except Karen, whose windows remained closed and whose car hadn't moved in days. She was still there, but her reign was over. By the end of that week, flyers were up, schedules confirmed, and speakers locked in. The neighborhood had never been more united. Ironically, Karen had accomplished what no one else could. She made the community come together. Just not the way she wanted. And as the date of the event approached, I could feel a quiet satisfaction building. Not because I wanted revenge, but because truth had finally beaten manipulation. And the people she'd spent years trying to silence were now the ones being honored, loudly, proudly, and without apology. The morning of the Veterans' Honor Day dawned with a sky so clear it almost felt staged. The air held that perfect spring sharpness, cool but edged with warmth, and the neighborhood was already buzzing before sunrise. Folding chairs lined the sidewalks, small American flags fluttered from porches, and families arrived early, dressed in red, white, and blue. Even the most indifferent neighbors, those who usually kept to themselves, had made an appearance. Something had shifted in this community. The fear that once surrounded Karen's clipboard tyranny had been replaced by a sense of collective ownership. This place finally felt like home to everyone again. My squad showed up early, moving with the same silent efficiency we always had. No barking orders, no fuss, just each man setting up his piece of the plan. Hector arranged the table for our fallen comrades' tribute, a single-place setting, a folded flag, and a candle. Clint prepped the podium and sound system with the help of two teenagers who clearly saw him as some kind of real-life superhero. Gavin double-checked the logistics with the fire department, who were already hoisting the massive flag between their extended ladders, high above the street. Every inch of the event had been thought out like a military operation, but with heart in every detail. At exactly 10 o'clock, the ceremony began. A local high school choir sang the national anthem as the flag waved behind them, sunlight slicing through its fabric like a spotlight from heaven. When the last note held, the crowd stood in solemn silence, hands on hearts, even the kids too young to understand fully mimicking their parents with wide eyes and small, respectful hands. That stillness was powerful. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than a speech ever could. I stepped up to the podium and took a deep breath. My speech wasn't long. I didn't want to make it about me. I thanked the community, I honored my brothers and sisters who couldn't be there, and I told them that respect doesn't come from titles, or positions, or neighborhood rules. It comes from action, from showing up, from standing tall when someone tries to cut you down. And most importantly, from standing together. Then I stepped aside for our guest speaker, the Marine Corps general who had flown in from D.C. to surprise us all. When he walked onto the stage, the collective gasp was almost comical. He looked sharp in his dress blues, and his presence radiated authority. But when he spoke, his tone was warm. He shared stories from the front lines, praised the importance of civilian-military unity, and thanked the residents for standing up for their veterans when one of their own tried to tear them down. Then, with a grin, he added, "And to the man of the hour, who handled himself with more grace and patience than I think I ever could have, Noah, consider this day officially recognized by the Corps. You've done your unit proud." The applause that followed was thunderous. My squad clapped me on the back, and for once, I let the smile stay on my face. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone, not anymore. But there was still one last moment that would seal this chapter for good. As the formal part of the ceremony wrapped up, the crowd was directed toward the far end of my yard, where a new wooden sign had been draped with a cloth. Kids gathered in front, cameras clicked, and I stepped forward with Gavin to pull the cover away. The sign was handcrafted, thick cedar, stained and sealed. Carved into it with precision and pride were the words, "Real Marines live here." Beneath that, in smaller letters, "Respect earned. Not given. Freedom fought for, never forgotten." It wasn't meant to be provocative. It wasn't meant to stir drama. It was a simple, permanent declaration of truth. One that no HOA ruling could ever override again. The crowd cheered. Some cried. Others saluted. But not everyone was cheering. From across the street, behind her curtain, Karen stood watching. She hadn't shown her face all day. Her house had remained shuttered, lights off, curtains drawn. But we all knew she was there. Watching. Listening. Seeing everything she couldn't control. And for once, saying nothing. A week later, Karen officially resigned from the HOA. The letter she submitted was short and stiff, filled with empty language about stepping back for personal reasons and respecting the evolving needs of the community. No one threw her a farewell party. No one stopped by to say goodbye. Her house was listed quietly through an out-of-town realtor. 2 weeks after the event, a moving truck showed up early in the morning. By noon, she was gone. Just like that. The board, under Leonard's new leadership, passed a motion making Veterans Honor Day an annual event. Not just for me, not just for my squad, but for every service member in the community, past and future. They also rewrote large portions of the HOA regulations, removing Karen's self-written amendments and replacing them with actual votes and community feedback. People started coming to meetings again, not because they were afraid of what Karen might fine them for, but because they actually had a voice again. In the weeks that followed, something strange and beautiful happened. People who had never spoken before started hosting barbecues together. Kids rode bikes freely without being yelled at for noise. Flags went up on porches that had been bare for years. A neighborhood that had once lived under the quiet weight of control and pettiness finally exhaled. And while there was still the usual suburban drama, lawn gnomes, overgrown hedges, the occasional loud teenager, there was also laughter, trust, and something we hadn't had in a long time: community. One afternoon, as the sun set over the rooftops, I stood in my yard with my squad, beers in hand, watching a group of kids race each other through the grass where Karen once threatened to fine a family for playing too rough. Clint clinked his bottle against mine and said, "You know, if she'd just left that flag alone, none of this would have happened." I nodded. True. But then again, maybe it needed to. Because sometimes it takes a fight to bring people together. Sometimes it takes a villain to remind you who your heroes are. And sometimes, when a self-appointed queen tries to rule with fear, all it takes is one Marine with a barbecue, a squad of loyal brothers, and a flag worth fighting for to flip the whole kingdom on its head. That's the thing about respect. You can't demand it. You can't fake it. And you definitely can't bully your way into it. You earn it. One action at a time. One day at a time. One truth at a time. And this time, the truth stood taller than any HOA rule ever could.